Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Pam Mertz. I am from the National Stuttering Association, and we welcome you into our fifth of our series of stuttering in the workplace topics for people who stutter and for people that work with people who stutter, including professionals in the field and employers. As we progress through the webinar today, we're going to be going through two parts. The first part will be informational and sharing from our guest facilitator today. And then our second part will be interactive, where we will welcome questions. And we are so delighted today to partner with the Job Accommodation Network. And we have a guest today from the Job Accommodation Network, Teresa Goddard, who is going to share information for employees who stutter about accommodations in the workplace and how to ask for those accommodations. So welcome, Teresa. We're so happy to have you here with us today.
Hi, Pam. Thanks so much for that great introduction. So I have some slides that I want to share with you today. So today I'm going to be talking with you about workplace accommodations for people who stutter. My name's Teresa Goddard. I'm one of the consultants here at the Job Accommodation Network, and I'm the lead consultant on the team that takes questions about communication disorders. And my background is that I used to be a speech-language pathologist before I came to JAN. I worked primarily in the public schools, but I really wanted to do something in the employment rights area, and that's what brought me to JAN. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Job Accommodation Network before we get started. The Job Accommodation Network has been around for over 30 years, and we do consultation on workplace accommodations, on laws related to workplace accommodations, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. And we also have a team that deals with questions about entrepreneurship for those who may want to start their own business or perhaps work from home. We have a very experienced staff, and any of us here would be happy to talk with you about your questions. About half of our calls come from individuals with disabilities and their friends or family members, and actually just more than half come from employers. And we also get calls from people who are supporting employees or employers, perhaps as consultants or as vocational rehabilitation therapists, maybe as medical professionals. So anyone can really call us, and it's always free and confidential. We're a national service. You can contact us from anywhere using our 800 number, 1-800-526-7234. And we also have an email address and an online chat that you can access through our website. We will always keep your information confidential. We won't confirm or deny who has contacted us. So if you have questions, you can feel confident that you'll get some good information about the Americans with Disabilities Act and related laws, how to ask for an accommodation, or if you have an employer that you want to support, you can refer them to us, and we can support them from the employer side as well. And we will always keep your information confidential. So next, I'm going to give you a little roadmap for today. We're going to talk a little bit about what reasonable means in terms of a reasonable accommodation. A lot of people are unsure what to request, and they want to know what that term means. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about the pre-employment process, since that's a part of the process where many people who stutter encounter difficulties, or maybe asking for an accommodation with an employer for the first time. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the interactive process, and that's the term for the process of providing an accommodation or deciding whether or not to provide an accommodation. We'll do some accommodation examples. We'll talk about the complaint process, and we're going to finish up with lots of time for questions. Okay, so many people are unsure as to what they can request. It's okay to request any workplace change that you think might be helpful to you. And another question that we often get is, what is a reasonable accommodation? Or is this thing that I want to request or that my applicant has requested, is it reasonable or not? Well, it turns out that the EEOC, the federal agency that enforces this part of the law that gives you the right to ask for an accommodation, has a definition of what reasonable means to them. It's a little bit vague, so bear with me. But a reasonable accommodation, according to the EEOC, the place that's in charge of this stuff, is any change in the work environment or in the way that things are usually done that results in an equal employment opportunity for an individual with a disability. So some examples might include if someone uses a wheelchair, making that facility accessible to them by installing a ramp, restructuring someone's job, which we'll talk about in a moment. It can include other things too, like purchasing equipment, modifying equipment, reassigning to a different position. This is also the part of the law that lets someone ask for an interpreter, providing an interpreter form of accommodation. And if you want to read more about that, you can do so on the JAN website. Then I want to talk a little bit about pre-employment requests. So sometimes there might be a test or some type of job task demonstration as part of your application process. We encourage employers to inform applicants in advance if there's going to be some type of test as part of the application process. Why? So that people can request accommodations if needed. A job applicant with a disability is responsible for letting the employer know that they need an accommodation. And if that pre-employment test is being offered by like an external testing company, you want to inform them as well in advance of the test date so that all of the paperwork that needs to flow can flow and whatever you need can be put in place. And remember, we're not just talking about accommodations for fluency. These same rules apply to things like deafness and someone who might need an interpreter. So they want you to ask well in advance because some accommodations take a while to get into place. You can make a request verbally, like by phone or in person, or in writing, but when you make a request, just be aware that you might have to fill out a form at some point in order to just keep the process flowing. So usually, and I want to make this point very clear, usually employers are limited in what they can ask you about any medical condition at the pre-offer stage. So you're applying for a job, but you don't have an offer yet, a job offer. However, if somebody requests an accommodation, that does open the door for an employer to ask certain questions, basically to figure out if the person is eligible for an accommodation. Do they meet the ADA disability definition? And does it make sense that a person with this disability needs what they're requesting? So sometimes you might have to connect the dots for an employer. So they might ask you things that they would not typically ask another applicant, but it's just part of the process. And it's good to answer those questions so that if you need an accommodation, you can get one in place in time for your interview or whatever stage you happen to be at. So the rule is, if the need for accommodation is not obvious, an employer may ask for reasonable documentation about an applicant's impairment because the employer has the right to know that the individual has a disability for which accommodation is needed. And the applicant with a disability is responsible for providing that documentation. Now that might include a letter from a medical provider, or it might include a form that the employer asks you to fill out. So if the need for accommodation is not obvious, then an employer can ask for documentation about it. So I know that's a little bit of a dry subject. If anybody wants to talk about it in detail, I am available at that 800 number after the webinar. So let's talk about a pre-employment example. An applicant for a research-based position felt that she was qualified for all of the jobs she was applying to, but she was having a lot of trouble getting past the phone interview stage. In her field, almost all of the positions required a phone interview before an in-person interview would be offered. And I think that's pretty standard across a lot of industries. Many people are reluctant to disclose that they need an accommodation at the interview stage. Sometimes people want to get the accommodation of doing the interview in a different way, but kind of feel reluctant to disclose why. Don't know a way to get an accommodation under Title I of the ADA without disclosing to the employer why you need it. So anyway, she contacted Jan because she was in the process of applying for jobs, and because she wasn't having a lot of success kind of going it on her own and just trying to get through the process without accommodations, she wanted some information on how to ask for an interview-related accommodation. One of the important things that we can do at the Job Accommodation Network is talk with you about disclosure, which is letting your employer know that you need an accommodation and have an ADA covered condition. And we talked with her about the process for requesting an accommodation at that interview stage. Now, hopefully, your employer's website is going to have some contact information for someone that you can contact if you need an accommodation for the hiring process itself. If you're having trouble finding that, you can always contact us and we'll try to help you through the process. But usually there'll be someone that you can contact. If you don't know who to contact and you've been offered an interview, maybe by an email, it's also okay to reach out to that person who invited you to the interview. But often people want to go through like an HR department as part of their initial request. And we suggest going through HR if possible as well. So one of the things you can ask for is alternate interview format if you're really not comfortable with the telephone-based interview. Some employers are going to be open to an alternate format like instant messaging or video chatting for people who are more comfortable with a face-to-face format. But some employers also use a telephone interview for a specific reason. Like they might be assessing your telephone manner as part of the process because perhaps the job involves telephone work. So sometimes, sometimes it's possible. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the interactive process. So the interactive process is something that is recommended by the EEOC, but it's not clear that it's absolutely required. We get a lot of questions about it at the Job Accommodation Network, and that's why we've developed a 6-step framework for the interactive process. I'm showing it to you because this is what we show to employers to help them understand the stages of providing an accommodation. So we're going to go through these in more detail, but the step 1 is making a request for the individual. It might be recognizing the request from the employer side. You're going to provide some information, explore accommodation options with your employer. An option will be selected, implemented, and then especially for on-the-job accommodation, not an interview-based one, we suggest monitoring the accommodation to ensure that it continues to be successful. So step 1 would be making your accommodation request. We recommend that you just be aware of your rights under Title I of the ADA. We have a lot of resources on askjan.org to help you be aware of it. You can also call in. We suggest documenting the request so that you have a record of what you've asked for and when. Technically, you can make a request verbally, but we suggest if you make a verbal request, you follow up in writing as well. And just clear and specific about what you need and why. So some general advice that we give is to describe the limitation and the problem. Use the term stuttering or fluency disorder. Employers are likely to understand those terms, especially the term stuttering. And just share with them what you think would help and why. We suggest that you use the terms disability and reasonable accommodation because those appear in the law, and that will help an employer understand what you're getting at. If you're more vague, they might not understand that you're requesting that your rights be respected under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So who can help with medical documentation? It doesn't have to be a doctor. If your employer asks for a doctor's note or asks for a doctor to fill out a form, a speech language pathologist or a vocational rehabilitation counselor, or any of several other different types of medical professionals might be able to do that. For instance, if you see a nurse practitioner as your primary care provider, it's likely that they can give you what you need. Now, this is a difficult thing for a lot of people to understand, but the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the federal agency responsible for enforcing Title I of the ADA and that writes all of our guidance that helps us understand it, does say that an employer should give primary consideration to an employee's first choice, to your idea. But they also have the flexibility to explore other options and can choose a different accommodation as long as they pick something that's effective. So I'm telling you this so that you'll be aware of what the EEOC says about employers choosing something different from what you've asked for, because it can happen, and it's something that employers are allowed to do. They're allowed to explore other options, and while they're supposed to give primary consideration to an employee's first choice, they also have flexibility to choose other things that might be easier for them to provide. We suggest that employers consult with service providers. So for someone with hearing impairment, it might be an audiologist. For someone who is a person with stuttering, it might be a speech language pathologist for information about accommodations that might work. The reason we do that is because employers are allowed to seek medical documentation. And while I believe that every person who's requesting an accommodation has good knowledge of their own needs and of what might work, sometimes it can be helpful to back up your own opinion based on your lived experience with something from a professional. It's not that I don't think you know what you need. I believe that everyone here has a good knowledge of their own abilities and what would help them. Now, you can also call the Job Accommodation Network if an employer is asking you for something and you're not sure if it's appropriate, or you're not sure how to approach a question you may have gotten from an employer. It's okay. It's always free, always confidential. So step 4 would be where the employer makes their choice of whether or not they're going to provide what you've asked for or something else that they think would work. At this stage, it's important for you to justify why you think your idea will work best. And you might want to provide some supporting documentation from a professional just to back yourself up. So here are some of the more typical accommodations, not just for someone with stuttering, but for anyone who needs a speech-related accommodation solution. A modified schedule is a very common request. If someone feels that they want to attend some treatment that would happen during the work week. And a modified schedule could mean some time off to go, say, to a speech therapist. But instead of just taking time off, like annual leave or sick leave, you might be able to flex your schedule or perhaps work through lunch and leave early. So there are different ways to do a modified schedule, and you might want to choose one that leads to less of your paid time off being used. If you need leave for treatment, we normally think that is for like a longer period if somebody wants to do something more intensive, but it could also mean taking unpaid leave or paid leave to go and get your treatment rather than just flexing your schedule. Modifying a policy could mean modifying any type of workplace policy. So if there's just something about the way your employer does things that doesn't work that great for you, or you could be more efficient if that could be applied to you in a different way, you can ask for that. So you can apply to things like attendance policies, for instance. Now, one thing an employer doesn't have to do is lower a performance or a production standard. So we do get questions from people, say, who work in call centers, who want to know if they can have an extended amount of time for a call, maybe because there's a policy about doing a call in so many minutes. That's something that the EEOC does not require an employer to change. Communicating another way is a very typical accommodation idea for someone who maybe feels they would be more efficient if they could communicate in a different way other than by phone, or in another way other than face-to-face. I think people have a good idea of what ways of communicating work well for them. So for instance, in the deaf community, when you might not have an interpreter present all the time, you might use texting and email as a good way to communicate. And people with other types of communication disorders can take advantage of that same strategy. Training modifications can be anything to give you equal access to a training. And job restructuring, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It can be very simple. It just means if there's some small part of the job, what we would call a marginal function, someone else can do that part. You were hired to do the main part of your job, which was what the EEOC calls essential functions. So if there's some small part that it would be easier if someone else were to do that, that's okay. The term for requesting that is job restructuring. And it could also include doing an essential function, but in a different way. Now, Pam, I think you had something you wanted to share regarding job restructuring.
Yeah, I do. So I just wanted to bring myself back onto the screen. So yeah, so actually I myself work in a school environment where I do have a little bit of an accommodation, and I guess it could actually be called restructuring. So I work in a high school, a public high school, and I'm sure you probably all can remember yourselves being in high school. If somebody needed to be called down to the main office, often people would be called over the public address system or the PA system. So from time to time, I actually need a student to be called down to my office, and I prefer not to be the one to have to make that announcement over the PA system, because I just feel uncomfortable stuttering over the loud speaker. So when I do need to have an announcement for a student called down to my office, somebody else in the office gladly makes that announcement for me, and in return I help them out with another task. So it's not a big deal. Nobody in the office minds, and it really doesn't cost anything, and it only takes a matter of seconds for that to happen. So that's a really good example of an easy accommodation that was made in my job site. So thank you for Teresa for reminding me that would be good examples to share.
Hey, thanks, Pam. Thanks so much for sharing that example. I think it really illustrates that sometimes you can do a part of the job in a different way, and it's completely fine. Now, if you liked to make announcements on your own and you wanted to do that, I would totally support that approach too. I think it's all about individual preferences and what works for the person who's seeking an accommodation. So another similar approach that we've seen from people who work in the public schools is if you have an announcement to make, maybe because it's for like a planned event, you could pre-record. Or we've talked to a few teachers who led after-school clubs, like the Leo Club, which is a type of service club associated with the Lions Club. And we talked to a teacher who wanted to announce some special events that were going on with that club, didn't necessarily want to make the announcement herself, and she had the students as a project work on what the announcement was going to be, and the students made the announcement about their club's event. So that's just another way. There are lots of different ways to accommodate in the same situation. But what I want you to take home from this slide is you want to make sure that you're disclosing and requesting accommodations as soon as you think you might have a need for something to change at work. You want to make sure that you're getting your needs met before things like your performance are impacted. So let's say someone is working in a call center and they know that they are falling behind on their metrics that they're supposed to keep up with for like how long a call is supposed to last. It's good to ask for an accommodation before that becomes a problem and they're going to receive something like a negative performance review. So it's good to ask early. You want to explain why you need what you're asking for, be prepared to provide documentation, and be prepared to look at other ideas. And you might have more than one accommodation. For instance, a person might have a modified schedule to let them attend a support group, but they might also be doing some type of job restructuring, or they might prefer to use some type of assistive technology to do part of their job. For instance, we once had a call about someone who was a computer user support specialist, and he wanted to have flexibility to choose between using a standard telephone and a TTY that would allow him to do some of his communication by typing. So he needed a little bit of a policy modification as well as some assistive technology to allow him to utilize that approach. That's just an example. So at stage 5, your employer is going to be implementing the accommodation and you want to be prepared to offer your input. And if they're asking questions, just make sure that you're responding so that the process keeps flowing. And we encourage employers to monitor that accommodation in an ongoing way. So if there is a problem and something that worked before isn't working now, make sure you know who to contact. One thing that we suggest is trying to find 2 people to serve as points of contact in case one has to go out on leave or leaves the company, so that you always have someone to go to if there's a need. So let's look at some examples. And this is from a real example from a real Jan call. There was an intern at a federal agency. She needed to discuss project details with her team, but face-to-face and telephone communication were difficult for her. So what her employer did upon learning about this, and after contacting the Job Accommodation Network, was they took advantage of a secure instant messaging client that they already had available to them as a federal agency. And that way, all of the team members had the option to discuss their ideas via a chat. Now, the intern was able to successfully exchange her ideas, and the team leader found it helpful as well. Her supervisor said that he really liked being able to see everybody's comments and questions kind of sequentially. It helped him keep up with the flow of the project and see how people were contributing. But they also worked on telephone solutions for her and training for the team, like disability awareness training, so that she could have the fullest communication experience possible at work. So that's just one example from Jan data. This person was not a person with stuttering. They had a different communication disorder, but I thought you might like to see it anyway. So here's an example that was about a person with stuttering. A university instructor, I believe they were in an anthropology department, wanted to know if an employer could consider providing speech therapy as an accommodation. And they actually contacted us together with someone from their office, from their department. And basically they wanted to know if it was okay under the ADA to ask for speech therapy or to provide speech therapy. But they also wanted to know other potential accommodation ideas as well. So the Jan consultant who spoke with them was not me, it was another consultant. And she explained that usually an employer wouldn't have to provide therapy, but an employer could do it if they could provide it if they chose to. Basically, it's something that would involve going beyond what's technically required by ADA, but the EEOC doesn't mind if employers go beyond what's required. But they talked about other options as well, like periodic breaks during a lecture, perhaps implementing a flipped classroom, where maybe some of the lecture material might be recorded in advance and the students would watch it as homework, and then the class time would be used in a different way, so that the students were doing more of the talking during the class time. So there's a lot of different approaches if you get creative. Here's another example. And I know I'm trying to be respectful of your time, Pam, so we have lots of time for Q&A. We got a call about a scientist. He was working in the federal sector. I can't say which agency, but he needed to attend conferences in order to present the research that he was involved in. And he was really comfortable with the presentation portion, like when he's just presenting his slides. He was fine with that. But he got very, very stressed out about doing a live Q&A at the end of his sessions. And he was getting so stressed about it that he was actually considering asking to be excused from an upcoming presentation. And I just think that would have been an unfortunate career decision for him. I think when you start avoiding situations that are good career moves for you, it's just not ideal. So we were trying to find a way that he could feel comfortable doing not only his slides, but also the live Q&A. And I know a strategy that some people use is just talk the whole time so that there's no time left for Q&A. He had actually been counseled about that. So the Jan consultant with whom he spoke suggested rehearsing possible questions and their answers, just like he did the rest of his presentation, so that he would have some kind of canned responses ready. We talked about seeking some advice from the treating SLP, like well in advance of the next conference, to see if they had any ideas. but the event was coming up like really soon. So the consultant suggested there's some other options that might help, might include having a support person present, maybe offering to respond to some questions after the session, maybe even having the support person screen the questions a little bit. You could offer to respond by email later. But one option that we talked about, which I know is a little controversial, is making assistive technology available to him so that he could say to his boss, look, if there's no other way, then I'll use this assistive technology to support me, but I will do the live Q&A. And again, I think that people know what's going to help them best. And I think we should respect people's opinions on what works for them or what doesn't work for them. I think employers really need to work on being open. So if you need to file a complaint, the last thing I want to talk about is how to reach the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They offer some technical assistance, so you can call them with questions, but you can also file a complaint with them. 1-800-669-4000 is their number, or you can go online to eeoc.gov. There are other ways to file complaints too, like through a state-level agency, and if you have questions about that, you can absolutely contact me afterwards or speak to anyone else here at JAN. So I think we have some time for questions. You can also find some information on the JAN website at askjan.org. We have a way that you can pose questions to a consultant by generating an email or by doing instant messaging through our site. But you can also call in if you prefer to do that. And that's the close of my prepared slides. I'm hoping for a lot of Q&A.
Teresa, thank you so much. What a great amount of information that you shared with us that I know personally as an employee who stutters was very, very helpful, particularly to have a lot of this information framed within the law here, particularly in the United States under the ADA Act. So yeah, and it is a lot of information that has been shared. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask, either specifically about what Teresa shared with us, or perhaps a question or a thought that came up while we were chatting? I know there was some back and forth in the chat section, but this is our time to for Teresa and or myself, both of us, to take some live questions. So you can either raise your hand and let us know that you'd like to ask a question, or you can certainly put it in the chat. So Andrew?
Yes, hi Teresa. My name is Andy Fitzenreiter and I live out here in Seattle. So I wanted to get your thoughts, because I know a lot of other people who stutter, and I mean we've been going back and forth for years about this. But what are your thoughts about disclosing the fact that I stutter on my resume? I mean, is that a good idea, or do you think that we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by doing that and putting it out there before we actually get even to the actual interview?
That's a great question, and it's something that comes up a lot. A lot of people ask us when to disclose, how to disclose, what would be the purpose of disclosing. I think it's a very personal choice. I think it's going to be a different choice for every person. Reasons to think about disclosing are when you know you're going to need an accommodation and you're going to have to disclose any way to get one. Another reason to disclose might be because it makes you feel more confident entering the process, that you've already put it out there. And a third reason might be if it's related to the job. So if you were, for instance, taking a job with a disability advocacy organization and you wanted to show your relationship to the disability community, that might be a reason to disclose it. And another reason that comes up sometimes, not so much with stuttering, but with other conditions, is to explain a gap in a resume. So for instance, someone who's had like a traumatic brain injury might be wondering how to explain that gap. There are different ways to approach that issue. I think the most important thing to do with a cover letter or a resume is show why you're a good fit for that position. So if there's a relevant reason to bring it up at that time, go for it. But if it's not necessarily relevant to the position or to the community that you're wanting to work with, then you might hold your cards a little closer and disclose at a later stage, maybe when you realize that you're going to need an accommodation for the interview. Or maybe you decide you don't need an accommodation for an interview, you're gonna wing it, that's completely fine. But a lot of people might disclose toward the beginning of a job interview or maybe during a pre-interview call, just so that it makes them feel more at ease. And it might make the person who's interviewing you feel more at ease as well. So I think disclosure is a tool, and you need to apply that tool at the proper time to achieve your goal. It's just my opinion.
Okay. So thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah, and yes, indeed. Thank you, Andy, for the question, and Teresa for fielding that. Would anybody else like to raise a question at this point?
I guess I have another one.
Sure.
Okay. I guess. So, well, now I don't know if this really has, to do with GAN. I mean, with, GAN, but, what is the role of, vocational rehabilitation? I mean, in the job process, because I know that I've talked to people who have gone through them before or whatever, and they've even offered to purchase them a Speech Easy device, you know, which helps people who stutter, or I know in the past, I've gone to them before also, and they've offered to help pay for a couple sessions of speech therapy. So, I mean, and again, I mean, I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question for you, but what is DVR? What are they obligated to do, I guess?
I think questions about what DVR is obligated to do are probably better directed toward DVR.
Okay.
That is because things could vary from state to state.
Okay.
Different places may have different policies, but where they can be really helpful are in some of the places that you mentioned. If you don't have documentation of a stuttering diagnosis and you think it would be helpful when you're requesting accommodations, then they may be able to refer you for an evaluation. If you desire to have some sessions of treatment, they might be able to help you get that. If you think that a Speech Easy would work well for you, I know some people love them and some people don't find them as helpful. Again, it's a personal choice. But if you want to explore some of those options, to use a Speech Easy or other types of delayed auditory feedback devices, see what they're like, maybe have an evaluation. VR can be a great place to get that process started, particularly if you don't have another means of accessing that type of healthcare. So they can be a good resource for that. They can also be a good resource in terms of finding employers in your area, perhaps that are disability friendly, getting some coaching, perhaps some trial mock interviews. If you want to do some things like that, make some connections, they can be a good resource. But I also know people who go to VR when they maybe need a device or need an evaluation, but most of the time might be job seeking more or less unassisted. And I think that's a personal choice. Some people have had wonderful experiences with their VR counselors, and some people, I feel like they prefer to go it more on their own. I think either way is fine. I think you should choose the approach that works best for you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And
So,
sorry,
I'm
Pam.
sorry, Teresa. So I am trying to moderate the questions. So we do have like 2 people on deck, but I wanted to be sure that Lisa Mooney's question was raised. She asked, she wanted to know if she could request an accommodation when having to do a group presentation. Her position at her workplace requires her to make presentations in front of a group. Would she be able to request an alternative way of communication for the presentations instead of standing up in front of people? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I actually saw that in the chat log, and I was hoping that you would bring it up. I think it's an excellent point. So again, the part of the law that lets you ask for accommodations is Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And complaints are processed, guidance is written by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. The EEOC does not care what you request. You can request any accommodation that you think would be helpful to you. So if you think you would maybe do a better job standing up, sitting down, with a microphone, without a microphone, using some type of assistive technology, being able to have a trial run in the room, you can ask for anything that you think would help. What you want to avoid is asking to be excused from an essential function. So by that we mean there are some parts of a job that are really central to the job, and you have to be able to do those parts of the job either the same way as everybody else without an accommodation, or with an accommodation. If you do it with an accommodation, you're just as qualified as anyone else. So I think the key part of that question is what she wants to do instead. So it might make sense for her to think about situations where she has presented information successfully in the past. If she has a treating speech language pathologist, she might confer with them also. If she participates in some type of support group or other stuttering related group, she could seek some information from other people in a similar situation on what's worked for them. And then she should make an accommodation request for something that she thinks would work for her. And most employers are not going to excuse you from an essential function because the EEOC doesn't require it. But it's okay to do something that the employer requires in a different way. So I think it's all about what would help her or what would help anyone else in the same situation. Does that help?
That was a great answer.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa. I didn't know you were coming in.
That's okay. Thank you very, very much. That was really a good piece of information.
So I think Melanie was on deck with the next question, and then we'll go to Gundala after Melanie. Melanie?
Yes, hi there, guys. Thank you very much. My question is, what if I feel that there has been some discrimination on my speech at work?
That's a great question. I know most of our presentation today was about asking for accommodations, but people with disabilities are also protected from other forms of discrimination and from things like harassment on the basis of disability. So if you think your rights have been violated, the one option that you have is to contact Jan for a free and confidential consultation,
Okay.
where we can direct you to some guidance, maybe guidance on harassment, get promotion, like that, and to kind of see whether the guidance from the EEOC matches up with what you're happening, and give you information on the complaint process. If you think your rights have been violated, it's also okay for you to contact the EEOC directly and speak to someone or set up an interview. They should be able to answer your questions about the ADA just as well as anybody at the Job Accommodation Network. But if you want to call in and even ask for me, that's totally fine. But the ADA is about more than just accommodations. It's also about protections from discrimination in hiring, in firing, and taking parts in other types of protected activities like filing a complaint. It can be about protection from harassment. So if you're having any type of work, it's okay to reach out and decide if you want to file a complaint.
If I drop you, you'll be very mad.
Yes. Someone can help too.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect then. Thank you.
I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, and next up, we wanted to be sure that we gave Gundala opportunity to ask his question. So you're on deck.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Teresa. So I'm actually a project manager, and my job needs to interact with various customers across the globe. And I would like to know what kind of accommodation I can request to my organization. So this is what I want to know, Teresa.
Well, you can ask for any accommodation that would help you to do the things that you need to do. I'm not sure where you're located, but within the United States.
No, actually, I'm from India, Hyderabad.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know much about the law in India.
Yeah, actually, I work for a global company. I work for Microsoft, so it's a global company, and we follow the equal opportunity across the globe.
That's a special situation since you're working for a U.S. company that has international operations.
Yeah.
I would really encourage you to contact me afterward because there's some information that I didn't prepare in my notes that I could share about that. But what we've told people in similar situations is once you've explored your rights and you feel confident asking for something, think about what you want to achieve. So in other words, what's the difficulty you're experiencing in the workplace? And then try to find a good workaround, whether that's changing the way you communicate in a particular situation, like using more instant messaging and email and less telephone, or whether that's trying to get some type of equipment, like a delayed auditory feedback device. Some people are helped by that. If you want that to be installed in your workplace, or you want to have permission to bring your own, you might need to request that. And I don't know much about how the law works in India. If you want to know more about accommodation options, though, I'd be happy to brainstorm with you about what's the workplace challenge and what are some workarounds.
Okay, sure. So thank you so much for the information you provided. So I'll try to contact you after this webinar. Thank you so much.
And anyone who has a question can absolutely send one in through our website, askjan.org. If you put my name on it, it will come to me. If you just say that it's about stuttering, you'll get someone who's knowledgeable about stuttering.
Okay, and it looks like we have 2 or 3 minutes left, so perhaps we can kind of wind up with the last question. I don't know, Melanie, would you like to ask your question verbally, or just have me share from the chat box? Whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I can ask. So, so in searching for a different job, I have filled out several several applications lately, and there's a page that talks about disabilities, and you can say yes or no or do not to answer. And I I was just curious on how people um, respond to that.
That's a great question. So the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to workplaces with 15 or more employees. So sometimes you may get things that you wouldn't ordinarily get, questions, forms, etc., in workplaces that are smaller than that. I don't know if that's what's happening. From your description, I'm guessing you're applying to some federal contractors.
No.
So a few years back, there was a new requirement for federal contractors to keep track of how many people with disabilities they have employed and to provide accommodations, which they were always supposed to do, but they're supposed to do more tracking now. So if you're filling out an application to work for a federal contractor, that might be a form that they're mandated to have people fill out. I think it's a personal choice how you want to fill it out. At the pre-employment stage, if people are thinking they don't want an accommodation, they might prefer not to respond. Some people will choose no. I think though that honesty is very important as part of the process. So if you're choosing not to say, yes, I have a disability, because you really prefer not to disclose at that time, then it might make sense to say prefer not to answer. But if you think you're going to need an accommodation, you may as well disclose, because that will cue them that you may be requesting an accommodation. But if people don't want to say that, they want to say prefer not to respond, I think that's a personal choice, and I think it's a very valid one. Again, with any type of communication with a potential employer, think about your goals and what you might need them to do for you at a later stage. I hope that helps.
Yes.
But we can talk later too.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Teresa.
Teresa, thank you so much for fielding those questions. And let me just thank everybody that tuned
Thanks, Pam. Yeah.
in today. It's you know, we received a lot of information, some really good questions and content in our chat section. So again, I want to just thank everybody, and especially again Teresa, for partnering with the National Stuttering Association to provide such, you know, valuable information. And I want to remind everybody that's here today to visit the National Stuttering Association's resources for stuttering at work at westutter.org/career success, where you can find information about the previous webinars that we held. I saw that John reminded everybody of the most recent one that we did on job interview skills, which did cover a few of the questions that we fielded today. And again, Teresa, thank you for this wonderful collaboration and sharing of information. I feel quite confident that you're probably going to get a lot of follow-up from today, and I think that will be terrific.
I really encourage people to contact Jan with any questions they may have. Thanks for inviting me, Pam, and thanks to Pam, John, and Charlie for helping me prepare today. It's been a pleasure.
It has, and thank thank you all very much. And we are right on time, 2 o'clock Eastern time. So thank you very much.